The church in Blackwood stood tall at the edge of the village, its stone walls darkened by centuries of rain and wind. From the outside, it looked like it had always been there, older than memory itself, with its crooked bell tower and the iron cross that seemed to bend under the weight of time. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and candle smoke, a kind of quiet perfume that clung to the wooden pews and the cracked marble floor. For the people of Blackwood, this place was more than just a church. It was the heart of their small world, where births, weddings, and funerals had been marked for generations. The villagers went about their lives as they always had. Farmers woke before dawn, their hands raw from the soil. The mill down by the river coughed out its smoke, painting the morning sky gray. Children played in the narrow streets, running past weathered homes that leaned into each other like tired old men. To outsiders, the town might have seemed forgotten, but to those who lived there, Blackwood was everything. Life was simple, predictable, and safe, or at least it seemed that way. The center of it all was the priest. He was a man who had lived long enough to see the seasons of the town shift, a steady presence who seemed carved from the same stone as the church itself. His voice, calm but firm, filled the room each Sunday. People trusted him with their secrets, their sins, their grief. He carried their burdens quietly, as if he had been born for nothing else. There were whispers sometimes that his past was not as clean as he liked to appear, that perhaps the life he led before the cloth had its shadows, but no one spoke too loudly. In Blackwood, the church was above question, and so was he. Still, beneath the calm surface of village life, there were cracks. The farmers complained that the church demanded too much tithe, even when harvests were poor. Some of the younger men grew restless, wondering why their families gave so much to a priest who seemed to grow heavier with gold while they scraped by. Old grudges between neighbors festered quietly, kept in check only by the priest's firm hand. And within families, there were quiet storms, unspoken anger, betrayal, or shame that were prayed over but never truly resolved. The church was the place where people brought their guilt, but also the place where it could be used against them. That year, the winter had been cruel. Livestock starved, the river froze, and hunger became an unwelcome guest in many homes. The priest spoke often of sacrifice, of faith, of patience and suffering, but his words did not fill empty stomachs. He still stood at the pulpit in his fine robes, candles burning bright beside him, while many in the village struggled to keep warm in the dark. A quiet bitterness began to take root in some hearts. The priest himself was not without his demons. He prayed longer than ever, sometimes alone at night, kneeling until his knees bled on the cold stone floor. There were rumors of him arguing with someone in the vestry when no one was there, his voice low but angry, as if fighting with shadows. His sermons grew harsher, his eyes sharper. Where once he had offered comfort, now he spoke of punishment, of sin that demanded blood and fire. Some parishioners lowered their heads, uneasy, but still they came. Because what else was there? Without him, there was no church. Without the church, there was no Blackwood. And then, without warning, death came. It was not a violent death, not at first glance. The priest was found in his quarters one gray morning, slumped forward over his desk, a half-written sermon beneath his hand. The candle beside him had burned down to nothing, leaving only a puddle of wax hardened against the wood. His body was still warm when he was discovered, but his eyes were fixed on nothing, wide and glassy. The discovery shook the village to its core. For many, it felt as though the very ground beneath them had split open. The man who had guided their lives, who had heard their confessions and judged their souls, was suddenly gone. People wept openly in the square, their cries carried on the cold wind. Others stood in silence, faces hard, as though unsure how to feel. The church bells tolled, heavy and slow, echoing across Valley. But even in death, the priest did not let go of Blackwood. His body was barely carried out before the church doors creaked open again. Candles were lit. The bells rang again. And when Sunday came, the congregation gathered as they always had. The pews filled, the altar was dressed, and the choir sang hymns as though nothing had changed. The air inside was heavy, but familiar. The strangest part was not that people came, but that the Mass continued, led by no one, yet somehow carried forward, as though the walls themselves refused to let the ritual end. For those who sat in the pews that morning, there was no comfort in routine. Instead, a cold unease wrapped itself around them. Whispers spread like smoke, that the priest was not done, that he still walked the church even in death, that the building itself was unwilling to let him go. And though no one admitted it aloud, every soul in that place wondered the same terrible question. If the church kept moving after the priest was gone, then who, or what, was leading it now? The death of the priest should have brought an end to things. For many in Blackwood, it should have been a moment to step back, to mourn, to pause the endless weight of ritual. Yet the church doors did not close. The candles lit themselves, the bells rang as though unseen hands pulled the ropes, and each Sunday, the villagers found themselves drawn back into those stone walls. At first, it seemed like loyalty or habit, but soon it became something else, an obligation they couldn't escape. The pews filled not out of devotion, but out of fear. People whispered that to stay away would invite misfortune, but the priest's spirit still watched them, weighing their every choice. It began quietly, with little things that could be ignored if one tried hard enough. A farmer swore he heard the priest's voice behind him during Mass, whispering a verse that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. A young woman fainted at the altar after claiming she'd felt a cold hand on her shoulder. The organ played notes that no one admitted to striking. These moments unsettled the villagers, but still they came. The fear of disobeying the church was greater than the fear of what was happening inside in private. Tensions grew sharper. Families fought about whether to keep giving money to the church when food was scarce. Some argued that the priest's death should have freed them, that they no longer owed anything to a man in the ground. Others clung to tradition, insisting that without sacrifice, the village itself would fall into ruin. The arguments were not just about money. They were about control, about faith, about the hold the dead priest still seemed to have over them. And every time someone tried to push back, something strange happened. Livestock dying suddenly, fire sparking without cause, children waking in the night screaming that the priest was standing in their room. These incidents silenced rebellion, binding the town tighter to the church even as it strangled them. Among the villagers, certain figures began to stand out, each carrying their own private storms. There was Elias, the blacksmith, a man whose back was bent from years of labor, whose hands were burned and scarred from fire. He had always kept his faith, but now he found himself boiling with anger. His wife, Marin, insisted on giving more than they could afford, placing coins on the altar each week, even as their children went hungry. Elias resented the priest, even in death, for demanding loyalty at the cost of his family. Yet at night, when he tried to speak of leaving the church behind, Marin's eyes would darken, her voice trembling as she whispered, "If we stop, he'll punish us." It was as if the priest had taken root inside her mind, speaking through her long after his body had turned cold. There was also Clara, the daughter of the miller, young and sharp-eyed, with a streak of defiance that had always made the older villagers whisper. She had never trusted the priest, and in his death, her mistrust only grew. She claimed the church was feeding on them, that they were being tricked into worshiping not God, but something else entirely. But her outspokenness made her a target. Others whispered that Clara had been touched by darkness herself, that her doubts were dangerous, that if anyone brought ruin to Blackwood, it would be her. The more she tried to resist, the more the town turned against her. And then there was Tomas, the caretaker of the church. He had always lived in the shadow of the priest, cleaning the pews, tending the candles, preparing the robes. Now, with the priest gone, Tomas carried himself with an odd mixture of fear and pride. He began to act as though the church belonged to him, moving about with keys jangling at his side, giving orders in the priest's name. People noticed how often he was seen alone in the vestry, speaking in low tones as though answering someone who wasn't there. His eyes grew hollow, his cheeks sunken, yet his devotion only deepened. He told the villagers that the priest's work was not done, that he had been chosen to carry it forward. Few dared to challenge him, though many doubted. The strain of the winter did not help. Food grew scarcer, debts heavier. Some families began selling heirlooms just to keep the tithe flowing. Others sank into despair, convinced that only obedience would keep their loved ones alive. In this suffocating atmosphere, suspicion spread like a sickness. Neighbors accused each other of giving too little, of inviting misfortune on the whole village. Children repeated things they claimed to hear in dreams, secrets that their parents had confessed to the priest long ago. People began to wonder how those private confessions were being spoken aloud, and whether the priest's spirit was dragging old sins into the light to remind them who still held power. The church itself seemed to change. The walls, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Shadows clung to the corners even in daylight. The crucifix above the altar tilted slightly, as if the weight of it had become unbearable. Sometimes, the air grew so heavy that villagers found it hard to breathe during Mass, as if the very stones of the church pressed down on their chests. And yet, no matter how strange or frightening it became, no one left. They told themselves it was fear of God, but in their hearts, they knew it was fear of the priest's point one night. Elias snapped. After another argument with Marin, after hearing his children cry themselves to sleep from hunger, he stormed to the church. He kicked the doors open, his voice echoing as he cursed the priest's name, demanding freedom. But the next morning, his forge was found destroyed, the anvil split in two as though struck by lightning. The villagers shook their heads, muttering that Elias had brought it upon himself. Marin, pale and trembling, fell to her knees before the altar that same day, begging forgiveness. Elias's anger curdled into something worse, helplessness. He became a man trapped, his strength turned useless against the unseen grip of the dead. Clara, meanwhile, grew more reckless. She began to speak openly of leaving Blackwood, of building a life far from the reach of the church. She urged others to join her, planting seeds of rebellion. But whispers spread faster than her courage. Villagers told Tomas what she had said, and soon Clara found herself followed by cold stares wherever she went. Doors closed when she passed. Children who had once played with her now hid behind their mother's skirts. The isolation gnawed at her, but she refused to bend. Each Sunday, she sat in the pews with her arms crossed, refusing to bow her head, daring the church to strike her. Some admired her, though silently. Others prayed for her, convinced she was doomed. Tomas became the most troubling figure of all. He claimed to see the priest in his dreams, giving him instructions. He said the priest spoke of betrayal, of sin festering among the congregation, and of a cleansing that was needed. People listened, frightened and weary, because Tomas spoke with the same cadence as the priest once had. His sermons, if they could be called that, were filled with fire and threats. He spoke of blood debt, of sins that would drown the town if not paid. Slowly, he began to demand more. More tithes, more offerings, more obedience. It was as if the priest's hunger had outlived him, growing stronger with each passing week. By spring, the village was a place of brittle silence. Smiles had vanished. Families no longer shared meals without suspicion. Every creak of the church doors sent a ripple of unease through the streets. The dead priest's presence had become the unspoken law, and Tomas his mouthpiece. Yet beneath the surface, resentment boiled hotter each day. Elias dreamed of rebellion. Clara dreamed of escape. Marin dreamed only of forgiveness. And the rest of the villagers, caught between fear and fury, felt themselves. Elves unraveling one thread at a time. It was no longer a question of whether something would break, but when. The church had become a prison, and prisons are not meant to hold forever. Something in Blackwood was reaching its limit, and the air itself seemed to hum with the promise of what was coming. The breaking point came on a night when the air itself felt heavy, as though the whole village was being pressed beneath an unseen hand. Clouds blotted out the moon, and the only light came from the church, its windows glowing with the pale flicker of hundreds of candles. Tomas had called for a midnight mass, insisting that the priest had spoken to him again, commanding the people to gather. Exhausted, afraid, and bound by habit, the villagers obeyed. One by one, they filed into the cold stone nave, their faces hollow with dread. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Candles lined every surface, their wax dripping down like blood. The air was thick with incense, choking, making eyes sting and lungs ache. The crucifix above the altar seemed to loom larger than ever, its shadow stretching across the congregation like an accusation. Tomas stood at the front, dressed in the priest's old robes, his thin frame swallowed by the fabric. His eyes burned with a strange light, and when he spoke, his voice was not quite his own. It carried the rhythm of the dead priest, echoing through the church with unnatural weight, that he spoke of betrayal, of a curse that lay over Blackwood. He said the priest had named those whose sins had doomed the village, and unless the guilty were punished, all would suffer. Murmurs rippled through the pews, nervous glances darting from one neighbor to another. Everyone carried secrets, and everyone feared being singled out. The tension twisted tighter with every word until the silence after his speech was unbearable. And then Tomas spoke a name, Clara. The sound of it cut the air like a blade. Clara stood frozen, her face pale, but her jaw set. She had expected something like this, perhaps not tonight, not so suddenly, but she had long known her defiance would draw their wrath. Around her, villagers shifted uncomfortably, eyes avoiding hers, yet no one spoke against it. Fear had tied their tongues. Tomas pointed a trembling hand toward her, his voice rising with feverish intensity, accusing her of leading others into sin, of mocking the priest, of spreading poison in Blackwood's heart. Clara did not bow her head. She stood, her voice steady but trembling with fury. "He is dead," she said, her words cutting through the haze of smoke. "The priest is gone, and what you worship now is nothing but a shadow. You feed it with your fear, and it will never stop until you are all consumed." Her words struck the room like a storm, but instead of freeing them, they bound the people tighter. Murmurs turned into shouts, anger spilling over. Some cried out for her to repent, others for her to leave. Tomas's eyes widened, his lips curling into a grim smile. He declared that the priest demanded a sacrifice, that Clara's blood was the only way to cleanse the village. Panic broke out. Elias rose from his seat, shouting for reason, his voice raw with desperation. He had long despised the priest's grip on them, and Clara's courage sparked something in him. But Marin pulled at his arm, her eyes wild, begging him to sit down before the priest cursed their family further. The pews creaked as bodies shifted, torn between loyalty and terror. Clara tried to push through the crowd, but hands grabbed at her, rough and unyielding. She struggled, screaming, her voice echoing against the stone walls. For a moment, the congregation became a frenzy of limbs and shouts, each person acting not as themselves, but as part of a mob, faceless and blind. The smell of sweat mixed with incense, the heat of so many bodies pressing in, the sound of her cries, all of it melded into chaos. And then the first blow fell. No one would later admit who struck her, whether it was Tomas or another villager caught up in the hysteria. But Clara stumbled, her face bloodied, her eyes flashing with disbelief. She screamed Elias's name, though even he was being held back, his arms pinned by men he had once called brothers. His roar of fury filled the church, but it was drowned out by the fever of the crowd. The violence escalated quickly, like a fire consuming dry wood. Once the first strike had been made, restraint collapsed. Clara was dragged toward the altar, her body fighting with every ounce of strength, her voice breaking into hoarse cries. Tomas's chanting rose above the din, his words a twisted E. Show of the priest's old sermons. Blood for cleansing, blood for salvation. His eyes gleamed, what with something close to madness. The final act was as brutal as it was inevitable. Clara was forced onto the cold stone before the altar, her arms held down by trembling hands. She begged them to see reason, her words desperate now. not for herself, but for them. "You are killing yourselves," she gasped. "Not me." But Tomas, with shaking hands, raised a heavy iron cross that had once hung above the altar. His face was a mask of devotion and terror, as though he too feared what would happen if he disobeyed the voice he claimed to hear. When the cross came down, the church erupted. Some turned away, weeping, others screamed, and still others fell to their knees, praying for forgiveness even as the act was carried out. Elias broke free, his fists swinging, but he was too late. Clara lay still on the cold stone, her blood staining the altar steps. The candles flickered violently, some going out altogether, plunging parts of the church into shadow. For a heartbeat, silence filled the space, as if the building itself held its breath. Then the aftermath descended like a flood. People staggered back from the altar, their faces pale, their hands shaking. Some denied what they had done, whispering that it had not been them, that it was the priest who had guided their hands. Others clung to the belief that Clara's death had saved them, that the curse would finally lift. Tomas stood trembling, the iron cross slipping from his bloody hands, his lips moving in silent prayer. Elias collapsed beside Clara, his body racked with sobs. Rage and grief tore through him, leaving him broken. Marin stood behind him, torn between horror and the conviction that what had happened was necessary. She whispered over and over that it was the only way, her voice shaking as if trying to convince hers. LF. The church bells rang then, though no one had touched the ropes. Their sound thundered through the village, carried on the cold night air, as though marking the crime for all to hear. People fled into the darkness, their footsteps echoing off the cobblestones, leaving behind only Tomas, Elias, and a broken body on the altar. The church no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb. That night, no one slept. Doors were bolted, candles burned low, and the silence of Blackwood was heavier than ever before. The villagers tried to tell themselves that Clara's death would be the end of their suffering, that the priest's grip would finally be broken. But deep down, they knew the truth. The act had not freed them. It had bound them tighter than ever to the church and to the shadow of the dead man who still seemed to hold their souls in his hand. The morning after Clara's death, the village of Blackwood did not feel the same. The streets were too quiet, the air too heavy, and the people moved like shadows, their faces blank with exhaustion and fear. The church doors remained shut that morning, though everyone knew the blood still stained the altar stone. No one spoke of it openly, yet the knowledge weighed on every breath. What had been done could not be undone, and what had been believed as salvation now felt more like damnation. Some villagers clung to denial. They told themselves that it had not been murder, but sacrifice. They repeated Tomas's words, that Clara's death had been demanded by the priest, that her blood would lift the curse. They whispered it at their tables, to their children, to their trembling hands in the dark of the night. But no matter how often they said it, the words rang hollow. The image of Clara's face, her voice crying out in fear and fury, haunted them. Some dreamed of her standing at the end of their beds, her eyes open, her skin pale, though she had returned to remind them of what they had done. Others were overcome with guilt. Mothers wept into their shawls, unable to meet their children's eyes, knowing they had stood by and done nothing. Fathers drank heavily, staring at the floorboards as though searching for answers in the grain of the wood. Friends avoided one another in the streets, afraid that speaking would drag the memory back into the open. Blackwood, once bound together by faith and ritual, became a place of silence and suspicion, where even the sound of footsteps felt accusing. For Elias, the weight was unbearable. He had fought against it, but not enough. He replayed the night in his mind over and over. The moment Clara called his name, the way he had been held back, the sight of her body crumpled on the stone. His anger at Tomas, at the church, at himself, ate him alive. He no longer slept, no longer ate. His forge remained cold, the tools untouched, as he sat staring into nothing for hours at a time. His children avoided him, too afraid of the storm in his eyes, while Marin prayed endlessly, her knees bruised from the stone floor, convinced that if she prayed enough, the priest would forgive them. Their home became a place of grief, the air thick with words unsaid. Tomas, in the days that followed, walked the village with an unsettling calm. He still wore the priest's robes, though they hung heavier on him now. His eyes looked sunken, his face drawn, but his voice carried the same conviction. He told the people that they had done what was necessary, that the priest had demanded it, that Clara's sacrifice had saved them all. Some clung to him still, desperate to believe, but more began to avoid him. Whispers spread that Tomas had gone mad, that he was no longer speaking for the priest but for himself. Yet no one dared to challenge him openly. Fear had already claimed too much that Clara's family was left broken. Her father, the miller, withdrew from the town, refusing to attend services, refusing to speak to anyone. Her mother wandered the fields at night, calling her daughter's name, her voice thin and cracked with sorrow. The mill itself fell silent, the wheels unmoving, and soon hunger deepened even further, pressing on the village like a curse that no blood could wash away. Clara's absence was more than just a loss. It was a wound that refused to close, a constant reminder of the price of fear and blind obedience. The community fractured. Some argued that Clara had been a martyr, not a sinner, and that her blood was on all their hands. Others lashed out, insisting she had brought it on herself, that she had invited the curse by defying the priest. Old friendships crumbled under the weight of blame, and neighbors turned cold to one another. What had once been a united village was now splintered, bound not by faith, but by shared guilt. Word of what had happened spread beyond Blackwood, though never in full detail. Strangers came through the town and whispered about a death in the church, about strange rituals carried out under candlelight. Some called it madness, others called it evil. For generations, Blackwood had been seen as a faithful village, a place untouched by scandal. But now, its name carried a shadow. Travelers avoided it. Merchants raised their prices, and the wider world began to see Blackwood not as devout, but as cursed. The psychological toll was deepest on those who had been closest to the crime. Elias withdrew further, unable to forgive himself for surviving when Clara had not. Marin clung so tightly to her prayers that she became a shell of herself, her faith turning from devotion into desperation. Tomas, though still outwardly strong, began to unravel in private. He was seen muttering to himself in the vestry, pacing the aisles long after the candles had gone out, as though searching for the priest's presence and finding only silence. Without the voice that had once guided him, he seemed adrift, yet he refused to admit it. The church itself stood unchanged, yet no one could enter without feeling a chill crawl across their skin. The blood had been scrubbed from the altar, but some swore they still saw it, dark and wet against the stone. The bells rang at odd hours, even when the ropes were untouched. Children avoided the building entirely, crossing themselves whenever they passed. What had once been the heart of the village now felt like its grave, looming over every moment with quiet menace. In the weeks that followed, there were attempts to move forward. Services continued, though attendance thinned. The fields were tilled, the animals tended, but nothing felt the same. Laughter had vanished. Trust had vanished. Every person carried the memory of that night like a stone in their chest, and no prayer could lift it. What haunted them most was not just the act itself, but the realization of what it revealed, that under the weight of fear, under the voice of authority, they had been capable of it. Neighbors, friends, even family had turned on Clara not because they hated her, but because they feared the priest more than they loved the truth. It was this knowledge, more than anything, that rotted Blackwood from within. The crime had not only taken Clara's life, it had taken the village's soul. The story of Clara's death and of Blackwood's descent into madness did not end on the night she bled upon the altar. The act lingered, stretching its shadow far beyond the stone walls of the church. Time passed, but the wound remained raw. For those who had raised their voices that night, or who had held her down, or who had done nothing at all, the memory never loosened its grip. It lived in the silences of their homes, in the way they avoided one another's eyes, in the tolling of the church bell that no one dared silence. For Elias, there was no escape. His grief hardened into something jagged. He could not look at his children without thinking of Clara's blood, could not walk past the church without feeling rage choke him. Once strong, once steady, he became a broken man, haunted by what he had failed to prevent. No law ever touched Blackwood. No constables rode in, no courts opened their doors. But Elias lived as though under a sentence all the same. He had once forged tools, shaping iron into strength. Now he carried only guilt, his hands empty, his life hollow. Marin found a different prison. She clung tighter than ever to her prayers, convinced that penance would save her family. But it was not faith that guided her anymore, only fear. She repeated the priest's name in her prayers long after others had abandoned it. Her lips cracked from whispering in the cold. In her eyes, Clara's death was necessary, even righteous, and a question it would be to admit her own part in the sin. So she built a wall of devotion around herself, never realizing that it kept her more trapped than free. Tomas's fate was more complicated. For a time, he continued to preach, still wearing the robes, still speaking in the voice that wasn't quite his. But the congregation thinned week after week. His words rang, weaker in the empty church, the echo mocking him. The villagers no longer saw him as chosen, but as mad. He became a ghost in the vestry, muttering to shadows, searching for the priest's presence that no longer answered. Eventually, he stopped appearing at all. Some said he left the village, others that he wasted away within the church, a man consumed by the very voice he claimed to serve. No grave was ever found for him. Clara's family never healed. Her mother's voice grew hoarse from calling into the night, and her father's silence became so heavy it seemed to fill every room. The mill decayed, its will still, its timbers rotting. Blackwood depended on it once, but no one could bring themselves to restart it, as though the very building belonged to Clara's ghost. Her absence had become a presence in itself, one that shaped the village as surely as the church had once done. The wider world did not forget either. The story spread, twisted with each telling, sometimes as rumor, sometimes as warning. Strangers spoke of the village where a girl was killed in the name of faith, where the dead priest still ruled from beyond the grave. Blackwood's name became a stain, its reputation marked by whispers of blood and madness. Merchants avoided it. Travelers skirted its roads. What was once a quiet and pious community became, in the eyes of outsiders, a place cursed by its own hand. Justice, in the sense of law, never came. No constables rode in to question the villagers. No court ever sat in judgment. The crime belonged entirely to Blackwood, and Blackwood alone bore its weight. But justice, in another sense, arrived differently. The village grew poorer, the fields weaker, the people fewer. It was as though the land itself withdrew its favor. Families left one by one, abandoning their homes for places where the bells did not toll by themselves. By the time a generation had passed, Blackwood was a shell, its streets empty, its church crumbling, its story kept alive only in whispers and in warnings. The tragedy revealed something that reached beyond the village. It showed how fragile morality becomes when bound by fear. It showed how the power of one voice, even a dead one, can bend a community to unthinkable acts. Blackwood was not unique. Its story could have belonged to any place where authority is left unchallenged, where faith is twisted into control, where silence becomes easier than resistance. The crime was not just the killing of Clara. It was the surrender of conscience, the surrender of love, the surrender of humanity in the face of fear. The villagers were not evil people. They were mothers, fathers, neighbors, children. Yet in the grip of fear, they became capable of evil. That truth is what lingered longest, the knowledge that ordinary Opal can be driven to terrible things, not by hatred, but by devotion misplaced, by the weight of tradition, by the terror of being the one to stand apart. In the end, Blackwood's story became less about a girl and more about the nature of belief and power. The priest, even in death, had shown the strength of control built on fear. Tomas had shown how easily a man could lose himself in borrowed authority. Elias and Marin had shown how guilt and denial can consume a family. And Clara had shown the cost of defiance, but also the necessity of it. For though she died, her voice remained in the memory of those who survived, a reminder that truth, no matter how fragile, must sometimes be spoken even when no one listens. The church that held Mass after its priest died became, in the end, a ruin. Its stones cracked, its bell tower leaning, its altar darkened by blood that no scrubbing could erase. But the lesson of it outlived the village. That faith without questioning can become a weapon. That power unchallenged can destroy, and that silence in the face of wrong is itself a form of sin. And so, the story of Blackwood closed not with justice in the eyes of the law, nor with peace for those who lived through it, but with a warning that carried beyond its borders. A warning about the weight of fear, the fragility of morality, and the shadows that linger when people give their will to the dead.